A murder that is of particular interest to me was of a 17-year-old boy by the name of Jess Washington in Waco, Texas, in 1916. He was seriously mentally challenged. The wife of the farmer that he worked for was found dead. He was arrested. He was brought to trial.
And Bloody Robinson resident Lucy Fryer was discovered. On the very next day, May 9th, the Waco Morning News begins to tell of the crime. Among the gruesome details of Fryer's injuries, a suspect is identified. He is 17-year-old Jesse Washington. 2 days later, May 10th, a Waco Morning News reporter writes the illiterate Washington signed a confession, which was also run in the day's paper. And a mob from Robinson begins searching for the teen. Within a matter of days, a jury was selected, and on May 15th, just 1 week after Lucy Fryer was found dead, Washington went to trial in what we now know as the 54th District Court. The confession he allegedly gave to Sheriff S.S. Fleming, the testimony that Washington showed investigators where the murder weapon was, and allegations that spots of blood were on Washington's clothing were all presented against him. The jury of 12 white men retired at 11:14 in the morning and returned with a verdict in 4 minutes. Guilty, to be sentenced to death.
The trial took from 10 until 12. And when the jury came back at noon and found him guilty, someone in the courtroom, and it would have been anyone in the courtroom, screamed out, "Get that nigger."
That's when an angry mob grabbed Washington and dragged him down these stairs and through this back door. Once outside, Washington was taken down this alley, and the torture that many now call the Waco Horror began.
And one of the worst and cruelest treatments of a human being began. Jess was kicked down out of the courthouse, down the back steps where a crowd of several hundred was waiting for him. They put a chain on his neck. There were 16,000 people crowding the street to watch this boy be tortured. Jess was tied to the chain over a branch of a tree. The fire was started. They raised Jess from the fire up into the air so that the crowd could see him. There were cheers, like at a football game, cheering the torturers on. When Jess tried to climb up the chains, hand by hand, they cut his fingers off one by one so that all he could do was slap at the chain. They lowered him back down in the fire. A man came up and castrated him. Another man kept a pole so that he couldn't crawl out of the fire. And time and again, they pulled him up to keep him from dying so that the crowd could be satisfied, until he finally died.
For 2 hours, he was continuously dipped in a fire while the crowd cheered. His body parts were cut off and kept for souvenirs. And once the mob was done, what was left of his body was placed in a bag and dragged back to Robinson, where it was hung from a utility pole. No one from the crowd of 15,000 people was ever prosecuted for Washington's lynching. Noel Smart, News, Channel 25. The Waco Morning News ran stories related to Jesse Washington for 7 days straight. But in the days immediately following the African-American teen's lynching, not one story, not one word.
That's why the NAACP was sending their own investigators in, so they could absolutely get the facts.
And the civil rights organization chose Elizabeth Freeman.
She was a very sharp cookie. She had a lot of street smarts.
The first Waco Horror author, Patricia Bernstein, says in a short matter of time, Freeman collected firsthand accounts from witnesses, spoke with city leaders, obtained the trial transcript, purchased the lynching photos, and found out exactly who the alleged mob leaders were. But there was one thing surrounding Washington's conviction and lynching that Freeman could not fully verify.
The truth is, we really don't know whether Jesse Washington actually committed this murder or not, and there's absolutely no way to tell.
It's been almost 100 years since the lynching of Jesse Washington. The old city hall where the teen was hanged no longer stands. Waconian folklore says the Waco tornado of 1953, guided by Washington's spirit, ripped through the city to exact his revenge and tear the building down.
One of the most disastrous tornadoes in modern history slices its way through the heart of Waco, Texas, leaving in its wake a spectacle of devastation described by one military man as that of a saturation bombing of a German city during the war. Military joined civilians in the heartbreaking task of searching for victims in the huge mounds of rubble. Even as these pictures were taken, the death toll in Waco stood at 108, with 10 more in San Angelo, 200 miles to the west. Equally hard hit are Waco's suburbs, where homes and cars are flattened as though by a giant fist. A city of 120,000 is left virtually paralyzed, with salvage pitifully small. The grandstand at the ballpark is reduced to matchwood. Full facilities of the Red Cross are mobilized to care for the hundreds of injured and homeless. The long task of digging out begins with workers clearing the rubble brick by brick, hoping to find survivors. Our church feels the violence of the great wind. In a year of record tornadoes, Texas bears the brunt of devastation and tragedy.
Thunderstorms move through, but 59 years ago today, it was a very different story. May 11th, 1953 was the day a massive tornado hit Waco, killing 114 people and injuring hundreds more.
An 87-year-old survivor of that terrible storm now lives in LaGrange, and that's where she told KXAN's Jim Swift her harrowing story.
Margaret Mann does not do well in stormy weather.
You just say storm, and I'm walking the floor. In fact, in that room in there, I have my pillows and my blanket, just in case.
What would you do with that pillow and that blanket?
I would get in there in that hall closet or in that bathroom and just cover up as best I can.
You see, on May 11th, 1953, a 3-month pregnant Margaret Mann was working with her husband in a downtown Waco paint store when hell itself dropped from the sky.
The debris going down the street, and it was so intense that you couldn't see across the street, you know.
Turning the pages of a scrapbook full of yellowing newspaper clippings, Mann recalls that dark afternoon with fresh dread.
We thought a tornado was what you have in Oklahoma in the spring. We had never, ever even experienced anything like that.
The scrapbook is an amazing record. But 42 years after the storm, a book of photographs came out. Photographs taken by Waco photographer Jimmy Willis. And one of the pictures in this book is worth the proverbial 1,000 words.
Americans watched breathless as FBI agents faced off with a self-proclaimed religious prophet and his armed followers in Central Texas. This was the Waco siege, a weeks-long standoff between the federal government and a religious group known as the Branch Davidians.
Jess was tied to the chain over a branch of a tree.
Established by leader Victor Haltef, the Branch Davidians are a Christian sect, an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, with a literal interpretation of the Bible's prophecies. Haltef and a group of his followers settled near Waco, Texas in 1935. Branch Davidians believe in the second coming of Jesus Christ and a day of judgment in which God will punish the wicked and reward the good. In preparation for Judgment Day, the Branch Davidians isolated themselves from the outside world in their commune near Waco. Confined to a 77-acre compound called the Mount Carmel Center, they established their own way of life. The group had gone through various divisions and changes in leadership before it was taken over by a charismatic Bible teacher named David Koresh in 1990. Koresh was a self-proclaimed prophet and believed that he was appointed by God to bring about the end of the world. Unlike his predecessors, Koresh practiced polygamy, taking a number of underage followers as wives who bore his children. He also collected guns and ammunition in preparation for the coming apocalypse. Word eventually reached federal authorities that the cult was illegally stockpiling weapons. On February 28, 1993, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms arrived at the Mount Carmel compound armed with search warrants for the property and an arrest warrant for Koresh. Gunfire erupted, although it's unclear which side started it. At the end of the 2-hour standoff, 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians were dead. The FBI intervened. Nearly 900 members of law enforcement descended on the compound, including Texas Rangers, Army personnel, and National Guardsmen. For weeks, FBI negotiators bargained with Koresh, bringing in supplies and allowing him to sermonize on the radio in a bid to get him to surrender. Though he allowed a number of Davidians to leave, Koresh displayed no signs of turning himself in. Agents then tried hardball tactics. They turned off the electricity, blasted loud music, and flashed harsh spotlights into the compound's windows. That didn't work either. After a 51-day standoff, Attorney General Janet Reno gave the FBI the green light to raid Mount Carmel. On April 19, 1993, tanks rolled in and punched holes in its walls and deposited nearly 400 canisters of tear gas inside the building. Several hours later, a fire broke out.
This far out in the country without fire hydrants, you have to haul all of your water. It's just a very bad scenario here at this point.
Winds fanned the flames and reduced the entire property to ash within an hour. Around 80 Branch Davidians died, including David Koresh and 25 children. While most died from fire and smoke inhalation, 2 members were found with fatal bullet wounds to the head. 4 federal agents were also killed during that siege. Several months later, a federal grand jury indicted 12 of the surviving Branch Davidians for unlawful possession of firearms and aiding the murder of federal officers. Many believe the government's actions were overly aggressive and maybe even illegal. The raid drew sharp public criticism, and controversy swirled over whether or not federal agents started the fire and shot the Branch Davidians. At the center of the storm was Janet Reno, who issued the final order to raid the compound. In 1999, she appointed independent counsel John Danforth to investigate the incident. Danforth concluded that the agents were not responsible and placed the blame squarely on Koresh and his followers for setting the blaze and shooting themselves in order to fulfill their apocalyptic prophecy. The investigation failed to satisfy critics who, to this day, believe in conspiracy theories of a federal cover-up. For some right-wing extremist groups and patriot militias, Waco was further evidence of a government willing to use its power against its own people. One of these extremists was a 24-year-old disgruntled Army veteran named Timothy McVeigh. Radicalized by Waco, McVeigh would retaliate for what he saw as the injustices of the Waco siege by bombing a federal building in Oklahoma City, exactly 2 years to the day of the siege at Mount Carmel.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Menagerie. Today's monster has never actually killed anyone, yet he is partially or directly responsible for the murders of 168 people and the injuries of another 800 in the worst terror attack in the United States prior to 9/11. On April 15, 1995, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols detonated a vehicle filled with 4,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, destroying 1/3 of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Upon his arrest shortly thereafter, among many white nationalist items, authorities found pages from the infamous book The Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries was written in 1978 by William Luther Pierce under the pen name Andrew MacDonald. The story depicts a violent revolution in the United States which leads to the overthrow of the federal government, a nuclear war, and ultimately a race war which leads to the systematic extermination of non-whites. McVeigh was obsessed with this book and sold it at various gun shows along with the various firearms that he was selling at the same time. The plot of the book revolves around a race war started by the government taking the guns of all citizens, forbidding, quote, white people from defending themselves from acts of violence, as well as uncovering a group of, quote, blacks who murder and cannibalize white people. These are just a few brief examples of the kinds of crazy that this story tells. One other notable point to mention is that the book is also where the term the Day of the Rope became popularized. In the story, it is the day when the protagonists, known as the organization, drag all supposed, quote, race traitors, judges, politicians, intellectuals, interracial couples, and of course Jews, among many others, out of their homes and publicly hang them in the streets. The book was a clear and profound inspiration for McVeigh and the atrocity that he committed.